Snow and rain came down together, as if the heavens could not decide which sorrow to pour upon the land. The wagon wheels cut through mud and slush, their iron rims shrieking against the frozen ground. Dorothy clutched her shawl tighter, the wet fabric heavy as a millstone upon her shoulders. Beside her, Margaret held the reins with stiff fingers, her jaw set against the cold and the shame that rode with them. Both sisters knew they were being delivered, though not like guests to a home, more like burdens to be left behind. The driver, a hired man with no stake in their lives, spat into the storm as the wagon lurched to a halt. Lantern light burned faintly through the blizzard haze, spilling from a cabin ahead. The man jerked his chin toward it. "This is the place," he muttered, eager to be free of his charge. Dorothy's heart faltered. Something in the line of the roof, the dark timbered porch, told her this was not the ranch they had been promised. But before she could speak, Margaret's hand pressed hers, a warning, or perhaps a plea to stay silent. The driver wasted no time. He tossed down the worn trunk containing the scraps of their lives, then cracked his whip. Horses snorted, reared, and carried him away into the white curtain. The sound of wheels faded, leaving only the storm's roar and the two sisters standing ankle-deep in slush, abandoned at the wrong door. Margaret's breath steamed in the dark. She was 26, her strength worn but not spent. She squared her shoulders, though the wet shawl clung to her like a chain. Dorothy, at 23, carried beauty like a curse. Her dark hair plastered to her cheeks, her eyes wide with both fear and yearning. She looked toward the light in the cabin window as if it might judge her before granting warmth. The door opened. A figure stepped into the storm. He was bare-chested despite the biting wind, his skin bronzed and scarred by years under sun and blade. His frame was massive, his long black hair whipped by sleet. The sight of him struck Dorothy speechless. Margaret stiffened, one arm instinctively in front of her sister. He looked at them not with suspicion nor with hunger, but with the quiet stillness of a man long accustomed to storms, both of sky and of heart. His voice carried low, a whisper nearly lost to the wind. "God finally sent you to us." The words unsettled Dorothy. Was it fate he spoke of, or folly? Yet the whisper warmed her more than the firelight she could not yet touch. Margaret narrowed her eyes, unwilling to yield to hope. "We were sent to the wrong place," she said, her voice taut as wire. "We'll move on." The man's gaze flickered toward the trunk half buried in snow, then to the frail shape of Dorothy, shivering beneath her shawl. He did not argue, nor did he step aside. Instead, he lifted the trunk with ease and carried it toward the cabin. No invitation spoken, no command given, just an act, decisive as thunder. Dorothy followed, her legs trembling, torn between gratitude and fear. Margaret hesitated at the threshold, the snow falling heavy upon her lashes. Pride held her back, yet pride could not feed or warm them. At last she entered, her shoulders rigid, as though stepping into a trial. Inside, the cabin was dim and close. Fire snapped in the stone hearth, the scent of pine smoke thick in the air. The man set down their trunk without ceremony. He took a wool blanket from a peg and draped it over Dorothy's shoulders, never letting his hand touch her skin. She felt the gesture like a vow, one that spoke louder than any word. Margaret remained standing, eyes sharp, her breath quick. She searched the room for danger, the rifle over the mantel, the hunting knife on the table, but found only silence and the weight of his presence. "Why would you take us in?" she demanded, suspicion laced with fatigue. The man poured water from a kettle into a tin cup, set it before her without answer. Silence was his answer. Dorothy, seated now, let the warmth seep into her fingers. She studied him openly, the slope of his shoulders, the scars across his chest. His silence was not empty. It was heavy with meaning, as if words had long since proved unworthy of his trust. Margaret's suspicion battled with exhaustion. Her body ached from days of travel, her spirit raw from the gossip and the cruel eyes that had followed them through towns. She had sworn not to bend, not to show need. Yet here in this cabin, the strength she wore like armor began to crack. The storm howled against the walls, rattling the shutters. Dorothy shivered beneath the blanket. The man stoked the fire higher, the glow casting his figure in amber light. Margaret's eyes softened for a fleeting moment, though she quickly masked it with a scowl. Hours passed. Outside, the world drowned in snow and rain. Inside, the three souls shared silence, broken only by the hiss of logs and the storm's fury. Each carried unspoken burdens. Margaret her shame, Dorothy her fear, the man his secrets. At last Dorothy whispered, "What do they call you?" Her voice was fragile, yet carried through the hush. He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his dark eyes, as if the question stirred some forgotten tenderness. "Elias Blackthorne," he said simply. Dorothy repeated the name softly, as though testing its weight. Margaret kept her gaze averted, unwilling to grant him the dignity of trust. The storm refused to relent. Hours turned to night, and the cabin's walls seemed to draw closer with every gust. Dorothy drifted near sleep, her head nodding against the chair. Margaret, weary but alert, listened as the storm swallowed the land whole. Then came the sound, muffled voices outside, faint beneath the wind. Lantern light bobbed beyond the frosted glass. Margaret stiffened, hand clutching her shawl tight. Elias rose, his height filling the cabin like a shadow made flesh. Dorothy startled awake, her heart quickening. The voices grew clearer, harsh with scorn. "That Comanche's taken in squaws! He'll bring shame on the town." The sisters' shame returned like a blade, cutting deep. Margaret's throat tightened. Dorothy shrank into the blanket. Elias stood unmoving, eyes fixed on the door as if the storm itself had come to challenge him. The lantern light swayed closer. Fists pounded against the wood. The night, heavy with storm and judgment, held its breath. And for the first time since their arrival, Dorothy feared not the storm, nor the man, but the world that waited just beyond that door. The pounding at the door echoed through the small cabin like a drumbeat of judgment. Dorothy clutched the blanket to her chest, heart hammering, while Margaret straightened as though to shield her younger sister from unseen blows. Elias Blackthorne did not flinch. He moved to the door, opened it with steady hands, and met the storm head-on. Lanterns bobbed outside, their glow revealing two men with hardened faces, and behind them the blurred figures of more, muttering through the wind. One pointed at the sisters. "You'll ruin yourself taking them in," he spat. "Heathen blood brings nothing but shame." Elias said nothing. He stood tall, the storm painting his hair against his shoulders, his silence more cutting than any words. The men shifted uneasily under his gaze. At last, the sheriff himself appeared, his badge glinting in lamplight. Amos Carver's weathered face carried both fatigue and authority. "Blackthorne," he called over the wind. "No one wants trouble. But keeping them here will bring it down upon you. Think wisely." Without speaking, Elias closed the door. The latch fell into place with a sound that rang final, like the toll of a bell. Dorothy exhaled shakily, relief mixing with dread. Margaret's chin lifted in defiance, though her eyes betrayed her unease. The voices lingered outside before fading into the storm, leaving only the crackle of fire. Silence settled again, heavier than before. Elias moved without fuss, setting a pan upon the hearth. He dropped in chunks of salted meat, poured water, and stirred with deliberate calm. Dorothy's stomach growled, betraying her hunger, and color rose to her cheeks. Margaret pressed her lips together, torn between pride and desperation. When Elias ladled broth into tin bowls and placed them before the sisters, neither moved at first. It was Margaret who reached out, lifting the spoon with stiff dignity, as though accepting charity were a battle to be won. Dorothy followed, sipping carefully, her lashes damp with unspoken gratitude. The warmth filled her, and for a moment, the storm outside seemed far away. Elias ate nothing. He sat across from them, silent as stone, watching the fire instead of their faces. Dorothy studied him shyly between spoonfuls. The breadth of his shoulders, the scars etched like history upon his chest. He was fearsome, yet the way he kept his hands folded loosely on the table spoke of restraint, as if every motion was measured to avoid harm. Margaret broke the silence first. "You'll draw their hatred upon yourself. Why risk it?" Elias's eyes shifted from fire to her, calm and unwavering. He did not answer. Margaret huffed, her suspicion thick, but Dorothy felt the quiet exchange settle deep in her bones. There was no performance in him, no defense, just an unspoken certainty that needed no words. As the storm howled, Elias rose and gathered their sodden shawls. He hung them by the hearth, the steam rising like ghosts. Then, he set about mending a broken chair leg, his massive hands steady with the knife, shaping wood with patience. The rhythm of his carving filled the silence with something softer than speech. Dorothy's gaze lingered on his hands. She remembered how gently he had draped the blanket over her shoulders. That small act replayed in her mind like a prayer. Her heart quickened with something she could not name, something both frightening and warm. Margaret, sensing her sister's thoughts, frowned and whispered sharply, "Do not mistake silence for kindness." But her voice lacked conviction, as though she, too, had seen more in his quiet than she wished to admit. By morning, the storm had dulled but not ended. A knock came again, gentler this time. Sheriff Carver stood alone on the porch, his face drawn, his hat rimmed with ice. Elias opened the door, blocking the warmth with his bulk. "I mean you no harm," the sheriff said. His eyes slid past Elias to the sisters by the fire. But gossip spreads faster than fire. Already the town whispers. "You can't keep them here without consequence." Margaret bristled, her protective stance rising again. Dorothy lowered her head, shame burning her cheeks. Elias remained a wall, silent, steady. After a long pause, the sheriff sighed and tipped his hat. "Your choice. But choices have prices." He left, boots crunching into the snow until only the wind remained. Margaret's voice quavered with frustration. "We should go. We won't be the cause of ruin." Dorothy touched her sister's arm, pleading softly. "We'll freeze out there. Can't you see he means us no harm?" Her voice trembled with both fear and fragile hope. Elias placed more wood on the fire, the sparks rising like stars. He glanced toward Dorothy, his expression unreadable, yet something in his eyes, gentleness hidden beneath storm-dark depth, made her breath catch. The day stretched long. Margaret busied herself with small tasks, sweeping, folding blankets, as if to prove they were not idlers. Dorothy gathered wood from the porch, her thin form braced against the wind, her fingers numbed. When she stumbled back inside, Elias took the bundle from her arms. His knuckles brushed hers, a fleeting contact, yet it sent a tremor through her chest. He set the wood down and without a word, wrapped her fingers in cloth to warm them, rubbing gently as one would tend a fragile bird. Margaret watched, torn between suspicion and something that edged toward surrender. The silence among them shifted, not empty now, but alive with the weight of unspoken things. Night fell once more. Outside, the storm pressed close. Inside, the cabin glowed with firelight. Dorothy sat by the hearth, her eyes heavy, yet her mind restless. She thought of Elias's whisper at the door. "God finally sent you to us," and wondered what it meant. Could fate have tangled their paths, or was it merely the cruel hand of error? Margaret, though weary, could not rest. She stood near the window, peering through frost. Lanterns flickered again in the distance. Voices carried faintly through the wind, sharper this time, laced with anger. "They're still there. Living under his roof. Abomination." Margaret's heart pounded. She turned to Elias, who stood already, as if he had heard before she did. He lifted the rifle from the mantel, not to brandish, but to hold ready. Dorothy's breath caught, fear surging anew. The cabin held its silence, taut as a bowstring. The sisters clung to each other, their shame and dread rising like a tide. Elias, tall and unshaken, faced the door. His voice, when it came, was scarcely above a whisper, yet it filled the room with promise. "They will not take you." The fire cracked. Outside, boots crunched nearer, voices sharp with judgment. The sisters froze, torn between terror and the strange safety of his vow. And as the door shuddered under the fists of men who would see them cast out, Dorothy realized their fate was no longer wandering. It was here, sealed within the silence of this cabin, and the man who had claimed it as their shield. The fists at the door gave way to voices carried by the storm, but Elias Blackthorne did not yield. He stood like a rooted oak, silent as the snow pressed harder against the cabin walls. Margaret clutched Dorothy's hand, both sisters trembling, not from the cold but from the shame of being judged like cattle in the night. When at last the lanterns receded and the footsteps faded, Elias set the rifle back upon the mantel. He did not look at them, only returned to his chair near the fire, as though standing against a mob were no more than tending a log. In the quiet that followed, Dorothy's chest rose and fell in uneven rhythm. She wanted to thank him, but the words tangled in her throat. Margaret's eyes were sharp with both relief and resentment. "They'll be back," she whispered, voice tight as wire. Elias said nothing. The silence pressed down again, heavy as snow upon a roof. The days that followed were marked by whispers. The storm outside calmed, but gossip inside the town swelled like a flood. Margaret overheard fragments when she fetched flour from the store. "Heathen sisters lodged under his roof. He's lost his mind. A Comanche has no right." Each phrase clung to her like burrs, and when she returned to the cabin, she carried their sting. Dorothy ventured less. Her health, fragile from the journey, weakened further beneath the weight of scorn she had not yet heard but could feel in the air. She helped where she could, folding blankets, brushing snow from the porch, but each task felt like an offering the world refused to accept. At night she lay awake listening to the storm's echo, wondering if the townsfolk's hatred would turn to violence. Elias worked as he always had, chopping wood, mending harness, bringing in game. Yet his silence deepened, his eyes darker, as though each whisper carried across the fields and settled upon his shoulders. He did not drive the sisters away, though it would have eased his burden. Instead, he brought food to the hearth, left water for them to wash, and when Dorothy's hands shook too badly to light a candle, he struck the match and set the flame himself. One evening, Margaret broke. She stood near the fire, her back to him, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. "Do you know what they said of us?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "That we were sold like scraps. That no decent man would claim us." Her hands balled into fists, her pride unraveling. "They aren't wrong. We were sent like animals and still, we ended up at the wrong door." The room held its breath. Dorothy reached toward her sister, but Margaret pulled away, shame burning her face. Elias, seated in shadow, lifted his gaze to her. He did not speak, did not argue, but his eyes did not waver. He bore her words as if they were stones thrown at him, not her. His silence gave them weight, turned her anguish into something acknowledged without pity. Margaret's tears came sudden, hot, uninvited. She pressed her hand to her mouth, unwilling to let him see her undone, yet knowing he already had. Dorothy watched, her heart aching for both of them, for Margaret's crumbling strength and Elias's quiet endurance. She saw something pass between them, not comfort, not forgiveness, but the smallest thread of understanding, fragile as smoke. That night, Dorothy could not sleep. She lay staring at the ceiling beams, listening to Elias carve wood by the fire. The steady scrape of knife against grain was a lullaby, patient, careful. She rose quietly and stepped closer, her blanket trailing. In the firelight, she saw the figure he shaped. Not an animal for hunting, but a bird, wings unfurled. His scarred hands moved with reverence, each stroke precise. "You carve as if it matters," she said softly. His eyes lifted to hers, surprise flickering in the embers of his gaze. "It does," he murmured, voice low as wind through trees. She felt the answer settle into her bones. Here was a man who built even in silence, who shaped beauty out of broken wood. She wanted to ask more, but Margaret stirred in her sleep, and Dorothy returned to her cot, her heart restless. Days stretched into weeks. Snow melted in patches, leaving the ground sodden. The sisters began to share the work without being asked. Margaret mended Elias's torn shirt, her needle trembling but steadying with each stitch. Dorothy gathered herbs near the creek, her skirts damp, cheeks flushed with the rare sun. In these quiet labors, they found fragments of worth, though the town still spat their names like curses. One afternoon, as Dorothy carried water back from the well, her knees buckled. The bucket clattered, spilling across the earth. She pressed a hand to her chest, her breath shallow. Margaret rushed forward, but Elias reached her first. He lifted Dorothy with ease, his arms warm despite the chill, and carried her inside. Margaret followed, her face pale with fear. Dorothy's fever rose by nightfall. Her skin burned, her lips parched, Margaret sat at her side, wringing cloth in cold water, whispering prayers. Elias remained near, seated in silence, his body tense with waiting. The firelight played across his face, revealing weariness he never spoke of. Through the haze of fever, Dorothy saw him. His eyes, dark and unblinking, fixed upon her as though he could will her back to strength. She felt the weight of his presence, steady as stone, and in that moment, the storm of judgment outside seemed far away. Margaret, watching, saw something she could not deny. This man who bore the world's scorn sat hour after hour, refusing to yield, his silence a vow stronger than any oath. For the first time, she did not see a threat in his stillness. She saw devotion, wordless and unshaken. When Dorothy's breathing eased at dawn, Margaret's tears fell freely. She met Elias's gaze across the room, and for once, she did not turn away. "Thank you," she whispered, the words raw, reluctant, but true. He inclined his head slightly, as though the gratitude belonged not to him, but to something larger, unseen. His hands, scarred and powerful, rested idle, yet the tension in his shoulders betrayed the depth of his vigil. The cabin lay in hush, the storm outside little more than a murmur now. Yet peace was fragile. Voices carried on the morning wind, closer than before, harsher, their anger no longer whispers but open threats. "Tonight we end it. No Comanche shelters heathens on our land." Margaret froze, her hand clutching Dorothy's weak one. Elias rose from his chair, his frame filling the room with quiet power. He moved to the window, gazing toward the flicker of lanterns gathering at the edge of the trees. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it filled the space with a weight that silenced every breath. "They are coming." The morning broke gray, the sky a low ceiling of leaden clouds that pressed against the earth. Snow fell heavy, clinging to branches until they bent beneath the weight. Elias Blackthorne stepped outside, the door creaking behind him, and drew a long breath that steamed in the bitter air. He had heard the voices in the night, threats carried by the wind, and he knew they would not vanish like shadows at dawn. Inside, Dorothy stirred weakly, her fever easing but her body fragile. Margaret sat by her side, her shawl wrapped tight, her eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. She watched Elias through the frost-streaked window, the massive shape of him moving with a patience that belied the storm she knew brewed in his chest. He chopped wood with calm precision, each swing steady, as though the rhythm itself was his shield against the world's malice. By midday, the sheriff arrived. Amos Carver's horse was lathered, its breath rising like smoke. He dismounted with a grunt, his boots crunching through the snow. Elias met him in silence, towering against the wind. "They'll come tonight," Carver said, his voice low, urgency beneath his calm. "I can't stop them. Too many with hate in their bellies. They mean to drive you out or worse." Elias said nothing, but his jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing toward the horizon. The sheriff shifted uneasily, his weathered face lined with regret. "You could send them away," he murmured. "It would cool the fire. No one would blame you for choosing peace." Inside the cabin, Margaret overheard. Her hand clutched Dorothy's, her heart thundering. Send them away. Yes, that was what the world expected. To scatter them again like wind-scoured leaves, to remind them they belonged nowhere. She felt the sting of it in her very bones. Elias turned back toward the cabin, his voice a low rumble. "This is their place." Carver held his gaze, then nodded grimly. "So be it. Blood will fall on snow before night is done." He mounted and rode off, leaving silence behind. Dorothy, pale but awake, whispered to her sister, "He won't let them take us." Her words trembled, not in doubt, but in fragile faith. Margaret's throat tightened. She wanted to protect her younger sister from disappointment, yet even she felt the truth in Dorothy's quiet conviction. The day dragged long, each hour heavy with waiting. Margaret prepared what little food they had, though her hands shook as she kneaded the dough. Dorothy tried to help, but weakness pulled her down, so she sat near the fire, watching Elias with tired eyes as he repaired the cabin's doorframe, securing the hinges against the storm. His silence was not cold. It was purposeful, each motion deliberate, as though every nail he drove was a promise. As night drew near, the snow thickened. Lantern light flickered in the distance. A line of men advancing through the trees, their voices sharp, carried by wind. Margaret stood, shawl slipping, her breath quickening. Dorothy's hand reached for hers, trembling. Elias rose, lifting the rifle from the mantel. His figure filled the cabin like a dark mountain. When the first fist struck the door, Margaret startled, her heart clanging like iron. Voices shouted, "Send them out! No Comanche shelters whores! This ends tonight!" Dorothy pressed close to her sister, her eyes wide with terror. Elias opened the door. Snow swept in, the lanterns outside casting wild shadows across his bare chest. The men recoiled for a moment at the sight of him, tall, scarred, unyielding, as though carved from the very storm. "You'll ruin this town," one man shouted, his rifle raised. Elias's voice carried low but steady, a thunder wrapped in restraint. "No one leaves this place tonight." The men muttered, shifting uneasily. Their courage, loud in taverns, faltered beneath his gaze. But anger stiffened them again, and one lunged forward, swinging the butt of his rifle. Elias moved swift, disarming him, tossing the weapon into snow. Another aimed, but before he could fire, Margaret stepped into the doorway, her voice breaking but strong. "You will not take us again." The crowd stilled, shocked by her defiance. Snow plastered her hair, her shawl billowed, but her eyes burned with dignity long denied. Dorothy, pale but resolute, stood beside her, leaning against the frame, her weakness masked by the courage in her gaze. The men sneered, shouting curses, but Elias's presence held them at bay. Then a shot cracked through the storm. The bullet tore past the doorway, splintering wood. Dorothy cried out, stumbling back. Margaret caught her, terror lacing her cry. Elias stepped forward, placing himself between the sisters and the rifles. Snow whipped around him, the storm itself seeming to rise at his side. His chest heaved, his breath steaming, but his voice remained quiet, unshaken. "If you want blood," he said, "then mine will be first." The mob hesitated. No one moved. Behind them, Sheriff Carver appeared, his rifle drawn, his voice commanding. "Enough! Stand down before this town stains its hands forever." The men faltered, anger clashing with fear. Lantern light wavered, shadows scattering across the snow. At last, one by one, they lowered their rifles, muttering as they turned back into the night. The storm swallowed them, their voices fading, leaving only the hush of falling snow. Margaret collapsed to her knees, clutching Dorothy close. Tears streaked her cheeks, hot against the cold. Dorothy whispered faintly, "He stood for us." Her words clung to the air like a prayer. Elias closed the door, setting the latch. His shoulders sagged for the first time, weariness carving lines into his face. He set the rifle aside, then crouched near the sisters. Margaret looked up at him, her eyes raw, the walls of her suspicion cracked. She managed a whisper, rough with gratitude. "You risked everything." Elias did not answer. He only reached for another log, placing it on the fire, the flames rising higher, warm against their shivering bodies. His silence was more than words. It was devotion sealed in action. Dorothy, trembling, let her hand slip from the blanket and rest briefly upon his. Her fingers were weak, but the gesture held a weight that stilled him. He did not move, did not pull away. Margaret saw, and for once, she did not scold or warn. Instead, she bowed her head, accepting the bond she could no longer deny. The night stretched on, the storm easing at last. The cabin glowed with firelight. The snow outside stained faintly red where the bullet had struck wood and flesh had brushed against splinters. Silence reigned, not empty, but heavy with the truth that something irreversible had taken place. As Dorothy drifted into uneasy sleep, Margaret leaned against the wall, her thoughts restless. She understood now that their lives were bound to his, whether by fate or by choice. Yet as the wind quieted and the flames dimmed, a single sound cut through the hush. Distant hoofbeats, slow and deliberate, approaching from beyond the ridge. Elias rose, his shadow tall against the fire. His eyes narrowed toward the sound. "It isn't over," he whispered. The hoofbeats came slow at first, muffled by snow, but they carried a weight that pulled every breath taut. Elias Blackthorne stood at the cabin's threshold, his broad frame outlined by the firelight within, eyes fixed on the white horizon. Margaret rose from where she knelt beside Dorothy, her heart pounding against her ribs. Dorothy, though weak, pushed herself upright, clutching the blanket tighter. None spoke, for the silence was louder than words. Through the haze of falling snow, lanterns glowed once more, but this time they moved with grim purpose. A small band of riders approached, rifles slung across shoulders, their voices hushed and hard. These were not drunk men stirred by gossip, but men who had chosen violence as their creed. At their front rode a figure Margaret recognized even before his face emerged from the storm. Ezekiel Brant, a rancher whose bitterness had poisoned the town for years. His scorn for Elias was legend, and his hatred for the sisters now burned in every line of his weathered face. "Blackthorn," Ezekiel called, his voice slicing through the storm. "You've defied the town. You've brought shame under your roof. Tonight we end this." Elias did not raise his rifle. He stepped forward, snow biting at his bare skin, and stood tall as a wall of stone. "You've no claim here," he said quietly, though the words carried as if the storm itself bore them. Ezekiel sneered, spitting into the snow. "No claim? You shelter them, and the town will never forgive. Let the squaws go, and perhaps we'll let you keep your land." Inside, Margaret's pulse hammered. Her shame warred with fury, but when she looked at Dorothy, frail, trembling, eyes wide with both fear and fragile hope, something in her hardened. She pushed open the door and stepped beside Elias, her shawl whipping in the wind. The men jeered, but her voice cut through them, ragged yet strong. "We will not be cast aside again." Dorothy, weaker, leaned against the frame, her presence quiet yet undeniable. Though her body faltered, her eyes did not. They fixed on the riders with a courage that came not from strength but from endurance, the kind that grows in hearts too often broken. Ezekiel's lip curled. "So you'd rather die in the snow than bow to decency?" His rifle lifted, others followed, steel glinting in lantern glow. Margaret's breath caught, her body tense, but Elias stepped ahead of them both, his chest broad against the storm. "If there is blood tonight," he whispered, "it will be mine first." The words struck like a bell in the dark. For a moment, even Ezekiel faltered. The wind wailed, snow twisting between them, as if the land itself held its breath. Then Ezekiel snarled, raising his weapon higher. "So be it." Before he could fire, another voice rose from the treeline. "Enough!" Sheriff Carver emerged on horseback, his rifle aimed steady, his face grim. "This town will not stain itself with this madness." His horse snorted, breath steaming, hooves sinking deep. Behind him a handful of townsfolk appeared, lanterns in hand, not with fury but with shame, their eyes cast low. Ezekiel cursed, rage boiling. "You'd protect him? You'd protect them?" Carver's voice held iron. "I'll protect this town from its own damnation. Go home, Brant." The standoff stretched, time suspended in the snow. Rifles wavered, men's courage faltered beneath the sheriff's steady aim and Elias's immovable presence. At last, one rider turned away, then another, muttering. Ezekiel roared in fury, but even he knew the night was lost. With a final glare, he wheeled his horse and vanished into the storm, his followers trailing, their lanterns swallowed by white. Silence returned, thick and heavy. Carver lingered only a moment, lowering his rifle. He met Elias's eyes with weary respect. "You've chosen your road. God help you walk it." Then he turned and rode back into the dark, leaving only the falling snow and the sound of breath. Margaret sank to her knees, her shawl slipping, tears burning hot against her frozen cheeks. Dorothy staggered to her side, clutching her hand. Both sisters trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of what had nearly been lost. Elias turned, his figure looming in the doorway, his hair wet with snow, his chest rising heavy. He knelt beside them, his scarred hands rough yet careful as he steadied Dorothy. She looked up at him, her lips parting with words that barely reached air. "You gave everything for us." He shook his head, silent, but his eyes betrayed what his mouth would not. Devotion carved deep, unspoken yet absolute. Margaret saw it too, and for the first time, her suspicion gave way to surrender. She touched his arm, her voice breaking. "You were right. God did send us here." The fire inside the cabin burned low, yet when they returned it seemed brighter than before. Elias added wood, the flames leaping, casting gold upon weary faces. Dorothy lay back, her fevered weakness softening under the warmth, her hand resting against his for a breath longer than chance. Margaret, though still guarded, let herself close her eyes at last, trusting the silence that had once frightened her. The storm outside began to ease, the wind dying into whispers. Snow lay thick across the land, but the night no longer carried threat. It carried promise, fragile and hard-earned. In the hush, Dorothy whispered to the shadows, half in prayer, half in awe, "Worth everything." Elias's gaze lingered on her, then out toward the snow where blood had almost been spilled. His jaw tightened, but his eyes softened, filled with something he would never name aloud. The cabin breathed with them, alive with the bond forged in storm and fire, silence and defiance. Yet as dawn threatened the horizon, a new sound stirred faintly in the distance. Hooves again, slower, deliberate. Elias rose, his silhouette vast against the embers, every line of him taut with vigilance. He knew the night's victory was not the end, only the beginning of what must be defended. And in that moment, as Margaret stirred and Dorothy's hand clung tighter to his, he understood. The storm had not come to break them. It had come to bind them.